Good evening, and thanks a lot, Ravi, for having us over here. It's a great honor to be sharing the dais with such stalwarts here, Professor Rangarajan, Professor Govind Rao, and Bhanumurthy. I think we could start by Professor Rangarajan giving a small, brief introductory remark on the book itself, and broadly what was the idea and so on, and then we'll move on.
Professor Sriram, Professor Govind Rao, Professor Bhanumurthy, and friends. First of all, let me thank all of you for your gracious presence this evening. I'm also thankful to the Bangalore International Center for organizing this program this evening, which is about my book, Forks in the Road, My Days at RBI and Beyond. Somewhere in the book I say, this is a book that must have been written many years ago. But I hesitated for a long time to write a book about what I have done or what events with which I have been associated. I was wondering in my own mind whether autobiographies have any special meaning. But then I decided that after moving away from public policy making in 2014, I came away to Chennai, and then I started thinking about writing the book. And so it was delayed also because of COVID and so on, but then finally the book was released last month. Everything in one's life is not planned. Some things are planned, but some things are, shall we call it, accident or unplanned. My being in the academia was sort of planned. When you finish your master's program and go on to do PhD, in my case I went abroad to do PhD, you choose what you want to do. The academic career is what you want. And therefore I would say that I chose the academic life, and it went on for almost 15 years in the academia, either both at home and abroad. But when I was called in 1982 to become a deputy governor, it was accident. It was an accident, unplanned, because I did not work for it. I did not even talk about it. It was not even in my mind, because that was the first time they appointed a deputy governor from academia. All the deputy governors of the Reserve Bank of India were either from within or from the government or somewhere else in the government. There is one exception, and that was R.K. Hazari. But he was editor of Economic and Political Weekly when he was appointed as a deputy governor. There is a political overtone to it. So I did not plan to become deputy governor. If it had not come to me, let me say, there would be no regrets. I would have continued in academia, written more articles, did more work in the same area. As somebody put, that much of life is a matter of circumstance. So I can also say that when I became governor in 1992, that was also a matter of accident. In 1991, after overcoming the initial problems faced by the country, I went on to become member of the Planning Commission. When I left Reserve Bank, I thought I was leaving it for good. but some events happened, and therefore I was called back to become governor of the Reserve Bank of India. So in some sense, these are accidents. Many people ask the question, when I first went to deputy governorship, that how difficult was the transition from academia to being an administrator or economic administrator. In some sense, I felt there was no problem. After all, as a professor of economics or monetary economics, I was dealing with the problems which the Reserve Bank of India was also dealing. And therefore, I thought it was a natural transition in that way. I felt at that time, we have been teaching for so many years monetary economics. Why not use that theory to answer to the practical problems of the day? Of course, there is a difference between being an academic and an administrator. An academic writes at his or at her own pace. There is no rush. This doesn't mean that they are not exerting, but the pace of writing and the timing of the writing is all that of the academic. But this is not so in the case of the economic administrator. You have to bring to bear all your intellectual powers at a time when a problem is being faced. If you are not able to marshal all your ideas at that time, then you may lose the chance. And that is why it is important that besides being a good intellect, you also have the power to marshal your ideas at the appropriate time. That's one difference. The other difference is that, as I say, the buck stops there. And therefore, you must take responsibility. I can quickly say one thing. When I first went as deputy governor of the Reserve Bank, there was one file that came up to me within the first week or so. It was by an executive director. And I did not agree with what he had written, and I thought it was patently wrong. Therefore, after looking at it, and then I called the executive director and started explaining why what he was written was wrong. He listened to me, and I thought he was going to reply to me. Instead of that, he said, "You have the prerogative to override me." So that means the buck stops there. You don't have to explain to the others why you are overruling it. You write it, of course, on the file, but that again shows that ultimately, if you take a decision, the responsibility comes from there, and you bear the responsibility for that decision. And I also feel that applying theory to practical problems is extremely important. In the book, I have a quote from Keynes, and I thought I will read out that quote that I have in the Keynes. I know it, but I will, anyway, not to make a mistake, I have written it. The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by nothing else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence, note what he says, are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. So whatever they might have read somewhere at the early times, and that is all what they remember, and that is what they implement. So I believe that there is a very strong case for applying theory to practical problems, and in fact influencing theory later on. I mean, I think it is not as if it's a one-way traffic. It is two. Therefore, I believe that there is a case for academics coming into government, and unlike the American situation, where academics come to government and then go back to academics or go back to their own positions. Of course, in the United States, they go to the extreme. They get not only people from academia, but also from business into government. And there a question mark rises. In fact, treasury secretaries have come from fund managers. And that really creates some real question mark about this kind of a transition. But there also, people go back because in the United States, even down to the level of deputy secretary, they are all political appointments, and therefore when the administration changes, they go back. Anyway, this is supposed to be an introduction. Therefore, I will stop before I make a few other comments and leave it there. The book is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 deals from 1982, that is when the story begins, or the narration begins, to 1991. That is when I was deputy governor. Part 2 deals with the period 1992 to 97, when I was governor. Part 3 deals with the positions that I held post 1997, first as Governor of Andhra Pradesh, then Chairman of the Finance Commission, then the Rajya Sabha. Can you hear it now? Can you hear now? Yeah. Then the Rajya Sabha, and then the Economic Advisory Council, and so on. The part 1 really describes the events that led almost to the crisis of 1991. I call it the war between the Reserve Bank of India and the government regarding the excess fiscal deficit and the monetization of that deficit. Described in some detail on the Chakravarti Committee report, which I virtually wrote. I can tell you in private conversation. Then, and to the eruption of the crisis. And I also talk about, by 1991, all the steps that we have taken, the devaluation of the rupee, and the sending of gold, shipping of gold abroad, in order to raise, you will be surprised, $400 million. Today, $400 million comes in not even in a week, in a few days you get $400 million. But that is what we had to do. And I hope you get the book and read that part of it where the shipping of 41 tons of gold from India to London in order to get that, pledge that money, pledge that gold, and get the loan in order to avoid a situation where there could be default. Just imagine an aircraft sitting there and 41 tons being loaded into it. And the 41 tons moving from the walls of the Reserve Bank of India, going through the main streets of Bombay, and then finally reaching the airport. I think you can note the kind of anxiety through which we must have gone at that particular time. Anyway, then the devaluation also had its own complications and so on. So I talk about all of that and end up with my membership of the Planning Commission and so on. Part 2 of the book deals with what we did during that period in terms of reforms. Monetary reforms, financial sector reforms, exchange rate reforms, and so on. It's a whole lot that we did at that particular time. The bringing to an end the monetization of fiscal deficit, and I think more importantly, dismantling the administrative structure of interest rates and compelling the government to go to the market, raise the required amount through auction. All that had become important. because you look back and see the central bank of the country acquired new instruments like open market operations. Open market operations are not possible if the bonds do not carry the market rate of interest. So the creation of a government bond market resulted in needed the creation of many other institutions in order to be able to do that. Of course, there was the strengthening of the banking system and so on. I will not go into it. And the part 3 describes about what I did as governor and so on. There are, these are positions in which you are more an advisor rather than a real player or taking the direct action. But in view of the various controversies that have come on the relationship between the governor and the chief minister, I would invite you to read the chapter that I have written and my own views on what I feel about this. I certainly hold the view there cannot be two centers of power in a state. But then you can also read what I have said. I'm not going to tell you what it is. You have to read it. It also says about what we do about the governor's speech. Then I have a chapter on Rajya Sabha also, in which I sat only for a short time, not for a long time. And it gives you some idea of what I felt about Rajya Sabha. Is it really the house of the seniors? I think I have a question mark on that. So, and then of course the Finance Commission, and finally the Economic Advisory Council. I would also say that there is a last chapter which is called My Ruminations. So this is the broad, the book that is this. For those who are wanting to read the book, there are two classes. One are professionals in economics. I recommend you read part 1, part 2 and part 3. For those who are not professionals in economics, I recommend you read part 1 and part 3. And part 2, you skim through it. There's too much said in the chapter of details on economics. So that is really the broad sweep of the book. I hope you buy the book and enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. That was a wonderful introduction to the book. May I request Professor Govind Rao to respond, and then we'll go to Bhanumurthy. Too many professors on the dais.
Thank you. Let me, Dr. Rangarajan, Dr. Sriram, Bhanu, and distinguished invitees and members who are present. Let me at the outset thank the Bangalore International Center for giving me this opportunity to read the book and then quite a lot of it was quite familiar to me, but read the book and to make some observations. It's not easy to make observations because I have worked under his guidance for almost 10 years. And as I was the director of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, and throughout the period of 10 years, he was the chairman of the institute, and then we used to exchange a lot of notes. He was the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council, and then I was a member of that council for almost 8, 9 years, until I joined the Finance Commission. So it's not easy to one is familiar with quite a lot of things that he had done, but at the same time, it's not easy to make a comment on the thoroughness with which he has gone, the granularity of the very details, which basically implies that he must have been planning this for a very long time, because the minute details that you see it in the book, it's not easy to unless you plan it, it's not easy to get. Very interestingly, Dr. Rangarajan says in the introduction itself that he has tried his best not to project himself. But he didn't want to be the centerpiece, that's what he says. But as we read it, you ask a question, can you have a Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark? I don't think it is possible. So what you have is Rangarajan as a centerpiece, a person who has led the entire economic reform program, particularly on the macroeconomy to begin with, in the most difficult periods of time. And Dr. Rangarajan's, sort of quoted Lord Keynes. In fact, as you go further up, it says, ultimately it is ideas, not vested interests, that are dangerous for good or evil. So, in fact, all the ideas were provided by him, and for good, not for evil. Let me put it this way. Now, there are lots of very interesting anecdotes, a lot of interesting, sort of very detailed granularity about the way in which he went about. 1982, when he joined the Reserve Bank of India, it was not an easy period of time. In fact, that is the time when India had gone to the International Monetary Fund. There was a foresight of the policy makers that they had to go to the International Monetary Fund because there was an oil price hike and there was a balance of payment problem. The current account deficit was very large. And then obviously he had to come in and start sort of dealing with the current account deficit issue. Now, the problem was that when he started, working on, there was, if you see the economic and political wiki pages at that time, there was a stringent criticism of the government and the Reserve Bank of India on the so-called conditionalities that the IMF was imposing. Our good, great public finance specialist I.S. Gulati was one of those who wrote a series of articles on the conditionalities. And in a sense, the foresight of the people prevented a serious crisis, and then we didn't take the entire tranche, and then we got back into the equilibrium. But in some sense, that was the wrong thing. It was wrong thing in the sense that possibly we should have had a much greater serious crisis, and we would have gotten into structural reforms much before. The issue recurred in 1991, and then again, Dr. Rangarajan was catapulted into fighting that particular thing. And of course, there are these are all things which are seen in drama, in movies, that the gold being transported, 41 tons of gold being transported to get the necessary foreign exchange. Before I say something more, I will not take much time because I think we should have more of this thing. He says somewhere that he has not spoken much about the period when he was an academic. As a teacher, possibly he was one of the most popular teachers in the Institute of Management. We used to hear about it. I was a student in Gujarat University those days. And we used to hear about Dr. Rangarajan. And generations of students have gone through his course. And generations have become, you had serious policy makers, academics all over the world, investment bankers, and then what have you. And then, everyone remembers him with reverence, and possibly we will be hoping that there will be one more volume that will come on his academic pursuits earlier. The test of any policy maker, and he said the buck stops here, is when the economy faces a crisis. and he was catapulted into that particular thing every time. 1981 was all right, but the 1991 crisis was a much more serious crisis. There was an interesting episode. He talks about the hop, step, and jump. Now, this hop, step, and jump was a double devaluation within the course of 3 days. And one was done basically to test the waters and then see how the market behaves. And before the politician could develop a cold feet, the second was done. By the time they asked what is happening, he said, I have jumped. I mean, that shows the decisiveness, that shows the urgency with which the things had to work. And obviously, once he jumped, nothing could be done. They had to take, because he did talk about the Chakravarti Committee report, and of course, the most important reform, I would say, during that period, was the signing of, and we have been hearing about Ministry of Finance and then Reserve Bank of India having differences of opinion all the time. But the most important reform that you can see is the 1994 signing of the agreement between the Ministry of Finance and the Reserve Bank of India with Dr. Rangarajan as the governor and Monte Carlo as the finance secretary. And that was the most important thing, because until then, the government deficit was simply monetized. The stopping of monetization of the deficit started, and in fact, that was operationalized from 1997. But that's a landmark reform, because, from there and the implementation of the Chakravarti Committee report, you could get the entire monetary policy into a market mechanism in that sense of the term. And I think that's one of the major the reform areas. I do not want to go on and on. There are several of those things I have written down, but then possibly during the course of our talk, sort of discussion, we can talk about it. But another important thing was he didn't talk much about the Finance Commission. Under fortuitous circumstances, I was to have been a member of the Finance Commission he chaired. The Minister of Finance advisor, Dr. Kelkar, called me and sought my consent. And then Dr. Rangarajan was the governor of the Reserve Bank, governor of the Andhra Pradesh. And then, of course, in the meantime, Dr. Chellaya called me and said that you should become a director of National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. I was in Bangalore heading ISEC. So Dr. Rangarajan called me to Hyderabad, we went, we discussed, he said, you write a note on what we should do in the Finance Commission. But as the circumstances went, when the announcement of the Finance Commission came, my name wasn't there. And that happens, so with the government, that always happens. In fact, there was another occasion where, Dr. Manmohan Singh himself as a Prime Minister called me and said that you should become a member of the Planning Commission, which never happened. So, these things one should take on one's stride. But, so I missed that opportunity in that sense of the term, though I became a member much later. But the work that the Finance Commission which he chaired, he didn't talk much about it. Well, the most important work that was done there was trying to put an end to this central government's intermediating the loans for the states. Until then, central government was giving loans to the states. Article 293 of the Constitution states that the states can borrow from the market. States can borrow. They cannot borrow internationally, but domestic borrowing is possible. But then it says, subclause 2 says, if a state is indebted to the center, then it has to seek the permission of the center to borrow. And our financing scheme was set that 70% of the money to the general category states was given by way of loans and 30% was by way of grants. Which means that every state was indebted to the center. and, which basically meant that it was basically the entire borrowing powers of the state was rationed by the center. So they didn't really have any. So it said, why should the government, the point is, why should the central government come and borrow from the market and then online it to the states? Let us stop this. That's one. Well, the issue has continued. If you remember last year, the government of India said that they are going to give 1 lakh crore loans to the states for 50 years interest free. In a sense, it's basically to tie the states down so that they don't have to, cannot exercise the powers of borrowing. That's one. Other most important thing that the Finance Commission did, 12th Finance Commission did, was the introduction of the rule-based fiscal policy. I mean, these are things which are very important because the fiscal deficit was going by the day, and then by, it was, when it, in 2000, I mean, again it had come to 9.5%, 9.6% of GDP. And obviously, he used a very useful, to those people who don't get it. I mean, if the household sector financial saving was 10% of GDP, current account deficit was 1.5%. If 1.5% is left for the public enterprises and 4% was to be left for the corporate, the business sector, you are left with 6%, 3% should be for the center, 3% for the states. And that became actually a rule. Now, you see, irrespective of, the implementation part of it, but a framework was put in place by the 12th Finance Commission, which has chaired, and possibly we need to strengthen that particular thing further. That's a different issue. But the point is, until then, I mean, Article 292 says that the government, the Parliament can put a limit, but then Parliament never bothered about it. And that is the time when the fiscal responsibility budget management. And for the states to make it, he gave the incentive that if you pass the fiscal, if you pass the FRBM Act, 50% of the outstanding loan of the states will be written off, from the center to the state will be written off, and with every improvement in the revenue deficit, there will be corresponding reduction in the loan from the center. I mean, and obviously every state except West Bengal and Sikkim followed that, and then this was followed up by the next Finance Commission, and then even they fell in line. What I'm trying to say is that it's not just in macroeconomics or monetary economics that it is this thing. And you ask anybody, so they say the Rangarajan committee. The question is which one? On every particular subject there was a Rangarajan committee. And again I was fortunate to have been a part of one of his committees, which is on efficient management of government expenditure, which did two important things. Number one, this plan, non-plan distinction should be done away with. Number two, central government giving directly money to the societies for the implementation of centrally sponsored schemes should be done away with. It has to go through the states. Because, one layer of accountability is used. So there are several of these that he has dealt with, whether it is on Jammu and Kashmir related issue, measurement of poverty, on many of the, there are several areas. It's difficult to recount all of them. And so we are grateful. We hope that, he has continuing, he has been writing obviously, particularly every week there is something he keeps writing. And I hope he will continue to do that and continue to give this same advice, whether somebody wants to listen to it or not. But then his advice is very important. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Professor Govind Rao. The this is the advantage of working closely with the protagonist of the book, that some stories which are inside stories will come out. If it's not there in the book, we can talk to Professor Govind Rao and get some further insights. Because Dr. Rangarajan has been quite careful in writing several of these incidents. I mean, on the gold transport, the vehicle got punctured. That detail, both of them are left out. And that's there in Dr. Reddy's book. So, I mean, so he's been, in the book itself, has been quite guarded about trivia and has been very substantial.
Mentioned about the
Yeah, you did. Yeah. But of course, that was not the day of social media, so it didn't become a very large issue. But Bhanumurthy, if you can give your this thing, and let's have some conversation with others. So if you can be brief on your observations, that would be useful.
So much.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
Sorry. First of all, let me thank BIC for inviting me to this event, and also making me to read twice. Actually, I got confused between December 28th and January 28th. So I remember I called because on 26th and I asked what happened to the program. So by then I read the book once. Now again I read the second time. So you have to bear with me. I have read the book and I'll be speaking a little more than others. So let me thank again Dr. Rangarajan for this book. My relation with Dr. Rangarajan was as a student, and I've been reading Dr. Rangarajan's articles, listening to him, and I also had a privilege that he was the one who appointed me as professor in NIPFP, and Dr. Govind Rao under the directorship of Dr. Govind Rao. And whatever the monetary economics that I learned, it is from Dr. Rangarajan's articles, and whatever I learned from fiscal, that is because of Dr. Govind Rao's publication. So I have monetary and fiscal. Whatever I learned, they are in the stage, and I know we have much better coordination on monetary and fiscal than what we have in the actual thing. So first let me, as Dr. Rangarajan pointed very clearly, the major part of the book covers his days at RBI, first as Deputy Governor and later as a Governor. Out of 16 chapters, 12 chapters focus on RBI days, and 4 chapters is actually his contributions as Governor of 4 states, his contribution to fiscal policy, as Dr. Govind Rao already pointed out, and a member of the Rajya Sabha, and it's a long innings as a chairman of Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. The chapter on advice to government, in fact that's the longest chapter, covers his contribution to public policy as chairman of various committees ranging from savings and investments, financial inclusion, petroleum taxation, Jammu and Kashmir, in fact HIV/AIDS in South Asia, sugar pricing, and National Food Security Act, and also the last one was on poverty estimates. I'm not here to summarize the book, but I thought to highlight the critical role Dr. Rangarajan has played in major policy decisions that has permanently changed the shape and destiny of the Indian economy for a good. Here he cautions, especially to students of economics, policy recommendations and decisions are the result of a confluence of analytics flowing from the theory, data, and importantly judgment, and not to be slaves to one school of thought, as already pointed out in his introduction. On the monetary policy, where he has made huge contribution, and is just pointed out that he's almost written the Sukhmai Chakravarti Committee report, and in some sense, the committee report paved the way for smooth transition for RBI and the monetary policy in the post-1991 period. The introduction of open market operations, dismantling of the automatic monetization, monetary targeting, and his belief on the stability of demand for money, these are all very well known. And indeed, Dr. Rangarajan is a staunch believer that inflation can be managed only by managing money supply growth, and it's also backed by the empirics. In the book, he quotes a very famous quote by Milton Friedman: inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, period, actually. And even now, those who are reading the recent writings of Dr. Rangarajan would know that the current bout of inflation in the global economy, he attributes to excess money supply in the global economy. In the last chapter on some ruminations, he highlights excess liquidity in India as the root cause for inflation. The other day I was talking to him, he was feeling little disappointed that monetary policy committee reports don't even mention the word money supply. I think that's where we might be going wrong, but he disagrees if the policies pursued during his governorship termed as a monetarist, and he argues that pure monetarists believe in fixed rate of growth of money supply, while RBI was following a flexible money supply targeting, and this has actually been laid the foundations for what we have right now, a flexible inflation targeting. Well, there are empirical issues and these relations are time varying. In fact, other day we had an argument between whether money M1 or M3. One aspect that I wanted to highlight is the way RBI under Dr. Rangarajan had a great coordination with the finance ministry and Dr. Manmohan Singh and later with Mr. Chidambaram. And no wonder that this book is dedicated to Dr. Manmohan Singh. And if one wanted to understand why this coordination is very important for macro stability, they should read the books published by successive governors. The books are like Who Moved My Interest Rate, I Do What I Do, I Do What I Don't Want to Do. So these are the books we have seen. But in fact, we had a fantastic relationship between Finance Ministry and the RBI. In fact, it was after many years, now we are seeing a better coordination between fiscal and monetary authorities, and the outcomes of such smooth relationship is clearly visible. The way India has managed the 1991 crisis, and as well as the COVID and the post-COVID crisis, including the Asian crisis, and ensured macro finance stability. After reading this book and also looking at the recent developments, somewhere I have written that monetary policy, fiscal monetary coordination is actually a public good, and it actually starts with Dr. Rangarajan's governorship at RBI and Dr. Manmohan Singh's finance ministry state. On the rules versus discretion, which is a major area of research in monetary economics, in page 212, it makes it very simple and concludes that rules cannot be too rigid, while discretion reduces accountability. He ends by saying, I quote, in the final analysis, we need both rules and discretion. On the banking and external sector front, RBI and Dr. Rangarajan has introduced various reforms, especially making both interest rates as well as exchange rates increasingly market determined. There was so much of an opposition for these policies, as Dr. Govind Rao pointed out, and even a bomb threat. I think that was something it was written in the book. In his own words, I quote, the shift to a market determined average rate of interest system was nothing short of a silent revolution. SLR was brought down drastically from 38% to 25%. The CRR was also brought down from 15% to 7%. The episode of exchange rate devaluation, again as Dr. Govind Rao pointed out, that had a code name, hop, skip and jump, is a must read for all the students if you want to really understand the main reform that happened in 1991. The way RBI jumped the decision before the Prime Minister thought otherwise, in retrospect, worked out well for the external sector. In addition to these changes and other reforms on the external sector brought true stability on the BOP. Indeed, the IMF, which was forcing India to go for full capital account convertibility, now has a different thoughts and appreciate the way India has managed its external account and its stability, and for this the foundations are laid in the early 1990s. Here one incident that the book highlights, and I thought I'll bring it for the benefit of students here. Rangarajan refers to a Deputy Governor's speech in Goa, where it was remarked there was a tendency for the rupee to be overvalued, and that led to some disturbance in the market. Dr. Rangarajan writes, I quote, it must go on record that this speech was approved by me, even though normally speeches of deputy governors did not require any prior permission. I take full responsibility for that statement and its timing. So I am bringing this to highlight the fact how Dr. Rangarajan has led the RBI from the front and protected the institution. Another aspect of external sector that needs to be highlighted is the RBI's conscious decision to reduce the proportion of external debt in the overall public debt. And this is one reason why India is largely immune to various global shocks. Government now claims that India has very low share of external debt and thinking to borrow from abroad. We have seen in the last budget there was some proposal. But this is a hard-earned distinction and efforts of RBI over 3 decades, and it was rightly struck down by all the central bankers. In fact, the central bankers, even after stepping down to the RBI, they still protected the Indian financial system, and one of the cases is how they struck down this whole plan of borrowing from abroad by the government. There is a one full chapter on social responsibility of banks. He talks about RIDF is established for enhancing rural credit, and the financial inclusion, that is another area where he has done so much contribution. It is during Dr. Rangarajan's period that laid the foundation for SHG bank linkages. In fact, that 10,000 CAF fund that was being provided to the SHGs, I think this country should be eternally grateful to him for making what is right now called Day NRLM, a movement in the rural areas contributing significantly to the rural livelihoods. The book also talks about autonomy of central banks, and I guess this keeping in view the recent developments that happened between 2018 and 2019. Here the book argues that there is a need for clear demarcation of who will have a final say and what areas, and he cites the new monetary policy framework as a good example for such arrangements. As someone described, the recent tussle between RBI and the government is nothing but a tussle between arrogance of power and arrogance of knowledge. Dr. Rangarajan calls as a clash of personalities and suggests, in his own words, I quote, "When all is said and done, a spirit of dialogue and accommodation must prevail." This advice, I think I'm just coming to the beyond RBI days. In fact, he clearly displayed during his stint at Andhra Pradesh. Now we're talking about one chief minister and one governor. During his regime, he dealt with 7 chief ministers. It's not one chief minister, 4 states and 7 chief ministers. Maybe I counted less, maybe more than that, I don't know. Without much tussle. If one has to understand the smooth bonhomie between governor and chief minister, we have to look at what is happening in some states at the present situation. Indeed, he says, I quote, "A public spat between governor and chief minister is undesirable. Whoever starts it makes a serious mistake." Unquote. The book cites some anecdotes while he was the governor of Andhra Pradesh, including the part of a ceiling falling on him. And I guess it was 2001, I think in the book it is written 2011. And also one of the chief minister wanted to meet him at level 13, as that is the auspicious time. So he quotes some of the anecdotes in that particular chapter, his days in Andhra Pradesh. One major contribution of Dr. Rangarajan, which the book just refers passingly, that I told him when I met him last time, is his contribution to the national statistical system. I think the big document, the 2-volume document that the National Statistical Commission has produced, I think that didn't get much space in the book, I thought. And I get a feeling that he's not fully satisfied with the way successive governments have implemented his recommendations, including the setting up of the National Statistical Commission. The committee suggested it to be a constitutional body, while the government constituted through an executive order and with an assurance that it would be made as a constitutional body in a year's time. And this was in 2005, and nothing happened after that. We're still waiting for the action taken report from the Ministry of Statistics, even after 2 decades. The other area, I think, Dr. Rangarajan's contribution was on Committee on Poverty Estimates, is another one that government has not taken further action. The committee was asked to relook at the tenure committee estimates. Now we still don't know which is the official poverty line and what is the official poverty estimates. So at the end, I'll just take 1 minute. At the end, the book, the Dr. Rangarajan ends with an interesting paragraph. I thought it was very interesting, and I'll share with all of you, where he reveals the rumor that he was considered for the position of the finance minister and that it was not without foundation. This was in the later part of 2008, I think post Mumbai attacks. Someone said between 2008 and 2018, it is a lost decade for Indian economy. Had there no folks in the road to becoming the finance minister, India's destiny would have been quite different. I just give one example why I say this. One major misstep, I must say, that was made during UPA 2 is the introduction of the retrospective taxation. And that was the beginning of the downturn of the economy. And as was written in the book, Dr. Rangarajan, as the chairman of Prime Minister Economic Advisory Council, says this was not discussed with the council by either by finance minister or the prime minister, and later he has opposed this move. But by then the damage was already done, and in fact it took almost 10 years to undo that mistake that was done in 2011-12. As he says in many places, I quote, like many other things in life, this is also a game of chance. And the appointment as FM is a chance that India has missed, and not just Dr. Rangarajan. To sum up, as the book narrates, Dr. Rangarajan's contribution to the public policy is wide-ranging and had a deeper impact on Indian macroeconomy and its stability. But he says it was never a smooth ride. In his words, public policy in general and in particular central banking is neither a science nor an art but craft. And there were hurdles all the way. His contribution to central banking, monetary policy, external sector, fiscal policy, statistical system, etc. are so huge that researchers on this area, when they start writing the history of Indian economics post 1991, they should be treating this as a pre-Rangarajan era and the Rangarajan era. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bhanumurthy. Actually, one thing that has happened, I mean, I'm very happy that the book has come out, essentially because we have not put Dr. Rangarajan's contributions in perspective, in one sense. You know, if you go back and look at the entire literature of how the economy was managed, his association with the Reserve Bank of India and the amount of contribution that was made to the financial sector, both in terms of reform and in terms of inclusion, has possibly gone unrecognized, essentially because at that time the media was not so active, it was not so hyperactive, and there was not too much of writing being done. You know, please imagine, I mean, what we are seeing today is he was there when the 1991 balance of payments crisis happened, managing that. He was there when the liberalization happened, and the first set of banks, I mean, all those banks that you see right now were licensed under his regime. Also, I mean, so if you think that he was a liberalizer and a very pro-markets person, you go back and look at the financial inclusion and other initiatives which are much more on the other side. That also happened during his time. So obviously, it was a fairly intense period, not too much of news, not too much of halabala, silently done, and I think that's something that we need to acknowledge. And this book sort of tries to, in its own very understated, modest way, tries to fill up the gap. While you know, Dr. Govind Rao did mention that it is not about Dr. Rangarajan. I mean, he says that it is not about Dr. Rangarajan, but if you look at it, the way the book has been written is more about policies, more about how one had to encounter it. I'd also, you know, indicated my little bit of frustration that he must have negotiated a lot during this thing, and that does not come out very clearly in the book. It's a very professorial book. I'm happy because I was never fortunate to be his student. You know, by the time I got into my post-graduation, he had already reached the Reserve Bank of India. But we were beneficiaries of the textbook that you wrote, sir, macroeconomics. I mean, so I'm a little bit of an eklavya for him. Now, we can have a round of questions here to Dr. Rangarajan, if Bhanumurthy or Dr. Govind Rao wants to ask a question. Otherwise, I'll start off. Otherwise, asking. My interest, because I work largely in the banking area, how did this liberalization process happen? 10 licenses were issued, and some of them quickly folded. This thing. How difficult was it for you to issue the licenses, and aftermath, how did you manage it?
You were talking about the license?
Yeah. Private sector bank licenses, the entire ICICI, HDFC.
When one of the objectives of banking reforms was to improve the competitiveness and efficiency of the system. Now, competitiveness was the byproduct of trying to improve the efficiency of the system. Many things were done, prudential norms, everything, establishing the soundness of the commercial banks. But at the same time, we thought that unless there is enough competition, that efficiency will not come. There were two things that were done in that context. One was essentially to actually reduce the state holding in the public sector banks from 100% to 55%. Many people do not realize how difficult it was. In fact, the Congress party has a deep commitment for nationalization of the commercial banks. I mean, they think it as if it is the biggest thing that Mrs. Gandhi had done. And therefore, because that required going to the parliament.
Amendment.
And it has to be an amendment. Therefore, with great circumspection, we had to go to the members of the parliament and tell them that this is needed. We had to tell them actually something which is not the whole truth. We told them that because it is 55% of the holding, it is really a government company, and therefore there is no change, and therefore allow us to reduce it to 45%, to 55%. But our own idea was that if 45% of the bank is owned by the private sector, then the bank will behave differently. But if we had said that, then we would not have got the amendment to the legislation. But we kept on saying, it is still a government company, it is still government owned, and don't worry about the social concerns and all that. I do believe, as Bhanumurthy mentioned, that social control was needed, and therefore we did not interfere with even the 45% priority sector credit to be compulsory. We didn't touch it. In fact, he mentioned about what I did for the SHG bank link scheme. In fact, Yashwant Thorat, who was the executive director in RBI and who later became chairman NABARD, wrote me a letter after the book was written. And he said that you have not taken credit for many things that you have done. And one of the things was this. He said, he has written me a letter saying that at that time, the entire bureaucracy in the Reserve Bank of India opposed that motion, opposed the idea of allowing the banks to give credit to SHGs because they are not recognized as an institution. And you overruled all of that and created this, but you don't say that. I said, and then he wrote that when the next edition comes,
Please add.
If you do not amend it, I will come with a black flag before your house. And so we essentially looked after all those dimensions. But let me not go into all of that. Let me come to the question that Sriram asked. I mean, so that is one aspect. The other was to give licenses to banks in the private sector. That did not require any legislative change. The Act permits it. The only thing is it was suspended and no action was taken. And therefore we had to do it. Therefore, there were some murmurs about it and so on, but we went ahead, stated our guidelines, and then started issuing. Actually, during the period that I was there, we had given almost 10 licenses at that time. And for the next 5 years or 10 years, there was only one license or something like that. Now, there is always a problem. When you start giving licenses in large number, one or two things may go wrong. But you can't, so long as you monitor it properly, even if one bank fails and it can be taken over, or one bank is sold to another bank, it can be done. Therefore, there was a need on the part of the system to have banks in the private sector. And the way that we implemented it was, the first set of private sector banks were essentially institutions which are already well known, like ICICI and HDFC and others, who have done considerable amount of work, and they were the ones who were first given licenses and they became private sector banks. That was one of the methods that we adopted to make this acceptable. In fact, in the International Monetary Fund said, no, this is not private sector banks. I mean, these are all banks, these are all institutions which are almost dominated by the... Yeah, so you have essentially converted them into the private sector banks. We want genuine private sector banks, they said. But I said, no, this is not correct. There is no government ownership in these institutions, and they could do it. And then we laid down, we followed a principle saying these kind of long-term lending institutions who could become. Then we said the non-bank finance companies. And finally, there was a big question about the private corporate sector. We did not allow private corporate sector at that time, and this has been the rule since then. The non-bank finance companies, there were always problems. I mean, there are always big companies behind non-bank finance companies also. And it's a very delicate game to be played. Therefore, I believe the most important step was to initiate this program and really make it acceptable by conforming to certain rules.
There's a small trivia, sir, that one of the conditions of licensing of private sector banks was they should be computerized from day one. And that was a time when public sector banks were resisting computerization. So this was in a way sort of, holding a threat to the public sector banks that look at
right. The private sector banks led the technology change.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, all of them didn't want too many people, and therefore technology platforms became the main attraction or the main element of the private sector banks.
In fact, there was a joke circulating in September 1999. There was a statement by RBI saying that 70% of the Indian banks are Y2K compliant. You know, we had that Y2K problem. So somebody put a footnote below, the other 30% are computerized. So, but anyway, yeah.
Of course, one of the important things when you are the governor itself is you mentioned that, because of the conflict of interest, the government, there should be an independent institution for government borrowing. RBI should not, sort of do that. Now, of course, this was basically the fiscal domination in monetary policy, and that's one of the ways in which the things have been done. And for development of the proper bond market, possibly that was required. But for some reason it has not happened. Even the Justice Sri Krishna Committee also made a recommendation that there should be independent, the institution for government public debt management. So what do you want to? What is your view on that?
I don't know. There are two things that we had suggested. One was also in the 12th Finance Commission report, which had been modified slightly by the 13th and 14th and said that is about the state government's borrowing. I mean, the state government's borrowing was, in a sense, arbitrarily, quote unquote, fixed by the central government. Therefore, we had suggested that a loan council be set up, comprising RBI, Planning Commission, the then Planning
Similar to
Commission.
Australian loan.
You're right, and therefore decide what the borrowing, sustainable borrowing of states rather than the central government doing it. In some form, your commission have also mentioned something similar to that. So that is the thing. The other thing about how much the central government itself should borrow, that is not something that, I mean, I think something like the fiscal council which is being talked about is clearly to say that what is a sustainable level of debt, and that sustainable level of debt should be fixed not so much by the person who is borrowing, the institution which is borrowing, but by somebody else. And therefore, the central government will always say whatever they are borrowing is very sustainable. Therefore, that is the thing. But I don't think any government in India will accept
They will
it.
make it sustainable by.
You're right. I think, yeah. But the whole idea is that if the central bank stood firm and said that if you are borrowing more, you will allow to borrow it at a higher rate of interest, and stood firm, then that will hit the government much more than anything else.
You have any question, Bhanumurthy? So we can take a few audience questions. Yes, we'll start with you, sir. He'll pass the mic around, because I think it's being recorded, so it's better that you speak into the mic, even though we may be able to hear you. Yeah.
I was a student, sir. 1968, 70, 2 years, sir. We cherish those memories.
You need to keep it a little closer.
My question is about debt to GDP ratio. I just went through some remuneration, your last chapter, where you have mentioned the India's debt to GDP ratio is now approaching 90%, state plus center. And there is a subtext of a concern. My question is, if China, which is 6 times larger than us, same population, etc., has as much as 250% of the GDP as its debt, is there any alarm in our 90% figure which you have? Is there a golden rule here? When do we reach a tipping point?
Part of my answer is that you have read only half of the paragraph. The other part of the paragraph in the book answers exactly your question. Namely, why Japan, for example, has 225% of GDP or something close to it. And we are 90% is very high, actually. I mean, I think that's not what we really want. We want something else. There are two related problems there. One is, why is a high level of debt bad? One part of the argument is, if the government has a very high level of debt, interest payments become a real issue. Now, today in India, interest payments as a proportion of the revenue receipts is exceeding 25 to 30%. For center alone, it is even higher.
Yeah.
It is 40%. Now, what we are saying is, by this level of debt to GDP ratio, you are preempting 30 to 40% of your revenue receipts for interest payments. This is a very dangerous situation. You have to really cut down. Now, in the case of Japan or China, whatever it is, that since their revenue receipts as a proportion of GDP is so high that in spite of being 250% of GDP, the interest payments in Japan is only 10% of the, or even less, it's a single digit actually, of the revenue receipts. So that is the real problem. Whereas in India, I think center and states taken together is what, about 25% of the? 24%. 24% of the GDP. So if the government is able to raise revenue as a proportion of GDP to a much higher level, then you can afford what you are talking about.
Revenue to GDP is just about 20%.
20%.
16%, 16.5% is tax, and another 3.5% is not tax.
So that's it.
Thank you very much, sir. I think you should get back to teaching, sir.
It is really half of what Japan is having.
Hi sir, my name is Gautam.
I'll come to you. Yeah, please go ahead.
And my question to sir is, what are your thoughts on the crypto industry and how the Indian government is dealing with the crypto industry?
Cryptocurrency and...
No, I think that goes very much outside the book. I mean, the point really is that it's a subject by itself. I mean, cryptocurrency has so many risks involved in it. In fact, whatever that has been happening in the recent period only goes to underline how risky it is. I mean, I think it's, the only question that arises is that if you ban cryptocurrencies, can you implement it? I mean, I think there are some countries in the world who believe that if you ban cryptocurrencies, it will come back in some other form.
Yeah, please go.
So, fantastic, sir. We've been keen students of you reading everything. Thank you for the book. We'll go through that. I do not intend to put it as an embarrassing question, but kindly permit me. Crony capitalism, corruption in the industry, banks' connivance. How come there is no single whistleblower from a banking system when a 15 lakh crore goes, or in the late 80s, so much happened? Could RBI have done something more on that, sir, or is it a societal problem?
On crony capitalism?
Banks, the phone banking and the abuse by public sector banks. So could RBI as bankers bank, could you have done something more, sir?
Well, in retrospect, one can say always that RBI should have done more, or the regulators should have done more. The question is that at the time when this thing was happening, whether it was obvious or not. Certainly, the idea of introducing the banking reforms and the prudential norms and so on and so forth was essentially, was particularly to ensure that the lending is being done according to certain principles. Now, they may have failed in some of these cases. Now, the whole question is sometimes people say that the regulators are too intrusive and really coming into the way of the functioning of the system. One has to strike a balance between the two, that one is not too intrusive, but at the same time that the proper management is there. I believe that there is a tendency in the country to tell the banks, lend more, all the time. I feel that a very, not very conducive to having prudential arrangements. The government always says, and take pride in the fact actually, that we are asking the banks to lend more. Now, is this the right approach? I don't know. I think, of course, they will always add at the end, subject, of course, to your taking the appropriate caution. But the idea is that the banks should really lend more. Therefore, in some sense, what we really need, I'm trying to do some work on that, namely that if you look at the period post 2012-13 and the rising NPAs, the problem is twofold. The rise of the NPAs could be because of what you call pure crony capitalism, or because of a deliberate attempt to give loan where loan is not deserved. The other part is, at the time when the loan was given, it was justified. But subsequent events have really made that loan untenable. This is what happened, at least part of the situation, part of the problem in the post-2011-12 period. What happened between 2004-5 and 2011-12, when the Indian economy was growing almost between 8 and 9%, was the terrific expansion of bank credit. That was a period during which the people thought that more credit should be given. And in a sense, I have written somewhere that this was very unduly high, actually. It is even much higher than the nominal rate of the growth of the national income. Perhaps somebody should have told them at that time, don't lend more. But that doesn't come very easily to the government or even to the regulator. That's also a problem.
No, can we, I mean, let's not have a supplementary, please. I mean, let's go on with.
So the point really is that at that particular time, everything looked rosy. The economy was growing at 8 to 9%. Therefore, in fact, we all thought at that time that we are licking poverty out of this country and so on. And in that moment, they made these loans. And the moment the growth started declining, what was viable and what was considered to be a good loan became untenable subsequently. Therefore, we need to distinguish between these two categories. I agree with you that there are cases of malfeasant or malafide arrangements. But there are also loans which have become bad because of the circumstances changed. Therefore, we really, and there was also, for example, the quantum of loans given to the power sector at that time, if you look at the number, and the power sector was essentially public owned at that time. And everybody said power is needed more and give. And, but then the power tariffs were not totally free and they were constrained, and the loans became bad there too. So we really need to have a very good analysis of what happened and what were the mistakes that were made. That is why I come back to the point which I said earlier, that the policy makers and the regulators and others should be very cautious when they keep on saying lend more, lend more. I think it's best to say not too strongly about these things.
Thank you, sir. Please.
I am Dr. Bhaskar Kailasam from Madras School of Economics. Sir, the coexistence between fiscal and monetary policy, how effectively they are cohesive in our country during the past 30 years.
What is it?
That's
Between fiscal and monetary.
the cohesion
Between
cohesion.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's one, and number two, the intergovernmental transfers between preferred states and non-preferred states, how that will affect the economy.
No, I will answer only one question. I will answer the first question, which is more relevant. And that is the cohesion between fiscal policy and monetary policy. Now, this is one of the major issues to which Govind Rao also spent some time in his remarks, and Bhanumurthy also referred to it. Namely, that there is need for coordination between fiscal policy and monetary policy. But this coordination should not be such that the basic ground principles are ignored. Excessive borrowing from the government on the part of the government must be discouraged. But there are methods and instrumentalities through which this can be done. The kind of dialogue that we have. And I think, in principle, I believe that inflation targeting is a good mechanism in this aspect. But It also depends upon how that inflation targeting mechanism is also operated. I mean, I think if we become very lax and loosely interpreted all the conditions, then it becomes different. So there is a term which monetary economists and fiscal economists use, what is called fiscal dominance. Fiscal dominance means a situation in which essentially the fiscal policy tells what the monetary policy should be. So which is the dog and which is the tail? I mean, I think the question is which is wagging which. And up to the end of 1980s in India, the fiscal dominance is absolute.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the monetary policy was a byproduct of fiscal policy. Since 1991, we have tried to establish some independence and some coordination so that the prudential principles, both with respect to fiscal policy and monetary policy, will be followed. So that is really the way to do it. Now, this can come, as Bhanumurthy quoted from my text also, from the book also, of how do you get along? I mean, and somebody asked me that between 92 and 97, how often did you fight with the finance minister? Standard question people ask. I mean, and what can be done? So I told him that between 1991 and 96 or 97, the country was going through a very difficult situation. We could not afford the luxury of the governor and the prime minister fighting or the finance minister fighting. So that overshadowed everything, and we worked together. But as I write in the book, very clearly that there should be coordination. But then there are some principles by which each of the instruments, each of the institutions responsible for the policy must hold strong. I think there are some fundamental principles by which the central bank of the country should stand, and it should not be compromising on that.
You should jump before they ask you to stop. Please, let's,
Sir, what are your views on full convertibility? Will we ever get there?
Yeah.
What are your views on?
Full convertibility of the rupee, and will we ever get there? Yeah. Mr. Ramurthy.
Obviously, full convertibility essentially implies that there are no restrictions on capital transactions. We are already committed to current account convertibility. That was done even during my time. Therefore, on current transactions, you should not put any restrictions. On capital account convertibility, essentially it means that any Indian citizen has the freedom to hold assets anywhere in any part of the world and so on. In some sense, capital account convertibility is there for foreign holders of Indian bonds, foreign holders of equity and all that. At any time they can bring in the money and they can take it out, sell it out and all that. Therefore, what is really happening, what is really meaning by capital account convertibility is the freedom given or the option given to Indian citizens to borrow, to keep money elsewhere. Now this can become a final solution at some point in time. But I think that cannot happen until the economy becomes very strong, until we are in a position to be able to take care of critical situations. Therefore, if you want to admit it as an element of a developed country, all our calculations show that it takes another 25 years or more to become a developed country. So I would say that this is an attribute of a developed country, and then we should wait for it. I mean, Whether capital account convertibility will hasten our becoming a developed country, that's a different issue. But I don't think so at the point. I mean, China, for example, does not have capital account convertibility. I mean, even though some of these countries are talking about establishing a group of countries having a common currency, not common currency in one major currency. China is working towards it. And we are also talking about the rupee area. But I have my own doubts about it, because all these currencies are not convertible in the full sense of the term, and therefore it is difficult. But the point really is that we yet have not developed the resilience to face a crisis of a big magnitude. Our reserves are strong, but they are strong only up to a point. And it is good enough to take care of current account convertibility. Therefore, I would not suggest going the whole hog on capital account convertibility. I think we should go in step by step. We should give capital account convertibility to business enterprises to do what they want. I mean, if they want to open a subsidiary in some other country, we should do it. That much we can go. But allowing anybody and everybody to hold money anywhere, hold asset anywhere, and so on and so forth, we'll have to wait.
I think we can take one last question from Mr. Bhanumurthy. I think we are completely time out, so you can interact with him outside.
More like a vote of thanks. I think it was a very timely, thoughtful of you to have penned down your thought. Since I was on the operating side of the banking system, and you were at the helm of the Reserve Bank for the 6 years, that was an area at a time the foundations of the banking became stronger and stronger. If today people are talking of digitalization, I must remember Rangarajan committee on technology. How come an economist writing on the technology, and that became the Bible for the banking industry to implement. There were huge demonstrations whenever Rangarajan used to visit any of the banks down with Rangarajan. And that is the time when the whole committee has been. Sir, only one question. You had an excellent relation, because it's like thick and soul. When Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, you were the Governor. Transition from that to the next successor, was it tough in your handling relation, or is it the image which you have already built in by your relation with Manmohan Singh acted as a conduit to ensure you are properly treated and received without any undue treatment?
No, we discussed this somewhat in response to an earlier question. The idea is that here are two agencies, and each has its own responsibilities, and a certain number of coordination is also required. You cannot have a loose fiscal policy and a tight monetary policy. I mean, this is not, but it has happened in the United States. There was a time when the fiscal policy was loose and monetary policy was tight. In fact, when the fiscal policy is very loose, the monetary policy has to be extremely tight in order to really hold stability. So there is need for coordination, and sometimes coordination is a matter of personalities also. I think there is a certain amount of give and take, and there is a recognition that each has his own responsibilities and therefore understand each other. But this cannot be left to personalities. I mean, I think a system cannot run based on personalities. The system can run only if there are sets of rules to be followed. So my answer is exactly the same that I said before, namely that there should be greater dialogue between the government and the RBI. I was told at some particular point the dialogue between the government and the RBI also broke down, and there was very little of the dialogue. And the dialogue should not only be at the highest level, but also down the line too. Therefore, that dialogue is needed. The spirit of give and take must be there. Otherwise, I think issues can be discussed refer to committees, and so on and so forth. But finally, I would still say that there are some responsibilities specific to each institution, and they should try to protect that.
Sir, would you like to have some concluding words? Otherwise, we can just...
I think I must thank you for your presence once, and I would suggest that you read the book. In my first comments, I did not actually go into the details of what I had written in the book, in the part 1, part 2, part 3. I did indicate only broadly, but reference was made later on as to some of the things that I have omitted to say. But I certainly believe that the strong set of reforms in the monetary field and the banking system were initiated at that time, and they perhaps helped the system to become stronger. And the other thing that I would also wish to say is that I think Bhanumurthy read that part of it, is that what we did about the foreign exchange system and the exchange rate
liberalize.
Is extremely important. I mean, I think I can tell you the trauma through which we passed when we decided finally that the exchange rate will be determined by the market. And I do, even though I have restricted anecdotes, I do have some anecdotes there. And I must say that when we finally decided on the market-determined exchange rate system, certain things followed. I also said, while discussing the market-determined exchange rate system, moving from the dual system 60-40, there were a lot of suggestions. Somebody said we should go to 80-20. And I also said in the book, who have said that also. So finally we took the decision, and finally I went to the finance minister and said, I take responsibility and we should really move to the new system where it is fully determined by the market, by the markets. And previously there was an official market and there is a pure market. And many people thought that when we move to the market-determined exchange rate, the rupee will fall steeply. Even the governor of Maharashtra told me that, P.C. Alexander at that time. And therefore, lot of people moved into dollar from rupee to come back into the rupee so that they can make a killing. This was the idea. And I knew at that time that we can manage it. And finally it happened that we managed that. And I indicate from there was a telephone call to me which said, you have ruined me and we will ruin you. And there was also the problem that there was a bomb beneath my office. And it turned out to be bogus, but it created, and then the police advised me, don't travel by the same route from your house to the office to prevent anything. But there is no other route in Bombay from the house to the Reserve Bank. There's only one road that goes. So the point really, but the tense situation that we had at that time, but we really made it. And as you know, for nearly 1.5 years, the dollar rupee rate stood at by 33.13 or something like that. And that enabled the country to accumulate reserves. Stability in the exchange rate was seen. So there are many things, and I must mention, because Sriram is also here, what we did on the side of the financial inclusion is also critically important. There are many things that we did that's also important. And what Bhanumurthy mentioned about the computerization is also critically important. Anyway, I think I should not talk more, lest you buy less of the book. And I think we have I think, whetted your appetite. And, but the point really is really to state what happened. It is, as Sriram had written, it is a chronicle of events. It may be a professor's chronicle of events, as you say. Because as they say, once a professor, always a professor. So it's a chronicle of events. But it is, I have tried to give more than the chronicle. I think there are there are many things that I have said in the book. Anyway, thanks a lot for your presence here, and I think Sriram can conclude now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, sir. As a disclaimer, I should say that the titles for the articles that you write in the newspapers are the editor's choice and not mine. So, that's, in fact, I've been at the receiving end of several book reviews essentially because the title is fairly misleading compared to this thing. But anyway, that's aside. I think, thank you very much for coming all the way to Bangalore and spending time with us. As soon as I read the book, I'd called Ravi and said we should possibly have an event in BIC, and Ravi said, immediately he said, yes, I'll talk to Dr. Rangarajan and we'll have him. Good that you were able to come. I think this session was an addition to the book. I mean, of course, we've read the book, but I think we benefited a lot more because several of some loose ends that we might have had in our minds when we were reading the book, some of them were clarified. There's a lot more to unpack. I don't think it can be done in a session of 1.5 hours. On the inclusion, I had a set of questions including local area banks, RRBs and other things, but obviously I held myself back because there's others and other interests that are, and I'm very sorry that I didn't allow a supplementary, but we were just managing time. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to BIC for providing this venue. Thanks a lot, Professor Govind Rao, as usual, passionately talking about finance commissions and devolution. We always see him so passionate about the center-state relationship. And thanks a lot, Bhanumurthy, for reading the book twice and, putting it so succinctly. I mean, I think you summarize the book very well. Thank you very much. Thank you, BIC.
Thank you, Professor Sriram.